Has the Initiative 71 crackdown begun? In this video, we'll be discussing the implementation of the Medical Cannabis Enforcement Emergency Amendment Act of 2024. If you are currently working in the cannabis gifting industry in DC, watch this video to find out if now is the time to get worried. My name is Joseph Scrofano, and I'm the founder of Scrofano Law PC, a criminal cannabis and DUI defense firm with offices in the District of Columbia, Rockville, and Fairfax. By the way of quick background, the District of Columbia legalized possession of small amounts of cannabis in 2015 after the infamous Initiative 71 or I-71 passed overwhelmingly, and the city's locally elected officials implemented the law by passing legislation. Now, this legislation opened the door to the creation of a massive unregulated gray or really black market for cannabis distribution. While the law legalized under local laws consumption and possession, it did not create a legal mechanism for sales and distribution. The fact that the law permitted gifting created a loophole where businesses would open and sell consumer products, things like stickers, lighters, shirts, and art, and would then gift quantities of cannabis that happened to match the price of the item. Deliveries and even retail brick and mortar sprung up across the city, all operating pseudo-legitimate businesses while gifting cannabis. So, why was such a counterintuitive law passed? In short, Congress. Our congressional overlords, both Democratic and Republican controlled, in their infinite wisdom, have every year since the law's passage slipped in a rider in a spending bill that explicitly prohibits the District of Columbia government from creating a licensing mechanism to distribute cannabis for recreational use. This rider has survived through 3 presidencies, from Obama to Trump to Biden, multiple changes of party control, and defied almost everyone's expectations, including third-term Mayor Muriel Bowser, who expected the rider to be lifted. The proliferation of unregulated gifting businesses certainly ruffled some feathers with the city's existing licensed medical marijuana dispensaries that had been operating for several years prior to the passage of I-71. The medical dispensaries have been upset that they were forced to comply with burdensome regulations that gifting operations largely avoided by operating illegally with little enforcement. So, the city council began an arduous process of trying to crack down on these unregulated businesses. However, there was no real political appetite in the city to arrest and jail citizens for purchasing, consuming, or even selling cannabis for that matter. But over the years, there were periodic raids on pop-up events in which MPD and the U.S. Attorney's Office seemed to target or view and claim they were the highest priority targets because these events typically allegedly had firearms and violence occurring at some of the events, and neighbors were often complaining about things like foot traffic, weed odors, and too many cars being parked at the location where the pop-up event was. Now, a lot of that enforcement stopped during the pandemic, with only sporadic raids occurring at brick and mortar shops where many times police would come to arrest the employees and seize whatever money and product was in the store. In many of these instances, the stores would simply reopen the next day. Then in 2022, mustachioed council chairman Phil Mendelson tried but ultimately failed multiple times to pass a civil enforcement bill that would allow regulatory agencies to start fining I-71 businesses to the tune of $30,000 to $60,000 a pop for each violation. At one point, and as we discussed in a previous video, the city government claimed it was going to create a task force that would include members of multiple regulatory agencies, including the Department of Tax and Revenue, the then Department of Consumer Regulatory Affairs, the Department of Health, and others to start issuing fines and citations to these so-called I-71 businesses. Now, the task force never materialized due to rumored opposition from the mayor's office. And so, over time, the city government's solution to regulating these unregulated businesses without going back to the draconian days of arresting folks for selling a plant that makes people happy began to crystallize. Congress was blocking the creation of regulations for recreational licenses. However, the city had already had an existing robust regulatory scheme for issuing medical marijuana licenses. So, step 1. the City Council passed the Medical Marijuana Self-Certification Emergency Amendment Act of 2022. This act permits any resident to self-certify that they have a condition in which they need cannabis for medicinal purposes, thus removing the pesky requirement of getting a doctor's recommendation. The law also shifted enforcement of the medical cannabis program from the Department of Health to the newly revamped ABCA, or Alcohol, Beverage, and Cannabis Administration, formerly known as ABRA. This basically allowed anyone in the city to get a medical marijuana card. Step 2. The council passed the Medical Cannabis Amendment Act, which removed the cap on medicinal dispensary licenses and provided a pathway for I-71 businesses currently gifting to enter the medicinal market. The bill also laid the groundwork for enforcement mechanisms for businesses that continue to operate in the unregulated market and didn't seek out a medicinal license. And while the bill was not without some problems, it certainly gave an appropriate FU to our congressional overlords who had been meddling in the city's local affairs regarding cannabis and thwarting the will of the tax-paying, unrepresented district residents for almost a decade. On top of that, it provides an added layer of legal protection by restyling these businesses as medicinal dispensaries. Also been in a separate rider that's been passed year after year in congressional spending bills since 2001 that provide limited protections for medicinal dispensaries by prohibiting the Justice Department from using funds to go after state-compliant medical marijuana dispensaries. So, not only can businesses with the medicinal license not only operate legally under DC law, while their activity remains illegal under federal law, technically, this amendment would prohibit the Justice Department, the feds, from going after them. In fact, under local and federal law, there is no greater legal protection available to any cannabis business than to enjoy the minimal protections afforded by this annual congressional amendment that protects medicinal dispensaries. Now that brings us to the existing climate and the local legal framework in the DC cannabis market today. Businesses that did what the local government wanted them to do, which was to apply for medicinal licenses, are supposed to now largely be permitted to operate legally, at least under local law, and enjoy some protections from federal enforcement once they receive a medicinal license, so long as they remain compliant with DC medical marijuana law. So, in summary, Congress has spent the better part of a decade blocking the DC residents and businesses from getting recreational marijuana licenses. The City Council finally had enough and did an end around of Congress by allowing for self-certification for medical marijuana patients and by pushing unregulated gifting businesses into the medicinal marijuana space. However, not all so-called I-71 businesses heeded the City Council's call and continue to operate without having applied for or received a medicinal license. Even more troubling, we're seeing reports of enforcement actions both on the civil side with ABCA and on the criminal side with MPD raiding businesses and arresting employees regardless of their license application status. Now, this is because in January of this year, as I mentioned at the jump, the council passed the Medical Cannabis Emergency Enforcement Act of 2024, paving the way for both regulatory and criminal enforcement. And while the legislation is supposed to protect businesses who have applied for medical licenses for regulatory enforcement, it does not prohibit MPD from doing anything it otherwise wants to do, nor does it have any effect on how the U.S. Attorney's Office would prosecute criminal cannabis laws for businesses and employees that do get raided. Will this trend continue or even intensify? It's always difficult to make predictions regarding the DC cannabis market given its volatility and unique vulnerability to congressional interference because DC lacks statehood. That said, I'm fairly confident of two things. One, the local government has had it with gifting businesses that are unregulated. The DC government wants to reassert control and shut down the unregulated market. It's been years in the making, and there are at least some signs and indications that the crackdown has finally arrived. I would expect enforcement and raids not only to continue, but also increase in number. Now, the open question remains whether judges in DC Superior Court will begin to take a tougher approach in penalties and sentences for individuals arrested for cannabis distribution related offenses. And a big open question is whether the feds will ultimately get involved and start prosecuting unregulated businesses under federal drug conspiracy laws. And why is the potential for federal enforcement such an important open question? Let me put it this way. Getting arrested for a cannabis offense by MPD and being charged in DC Superior Court can ruin your day. Getting arrested by the feds and charged in a federal drug conspiracy in federal district court can ruin your life. So, is it time to worry for individuals who remain in the unregulated market without having at least applied for a medicinal marijuana dispensary license? My answer is unequivocally yes. In fact, I believe it may be time for all businesses that do not have an actual medicinal license to worry. And because no medical license have been issued as of yet, at least in this humble criminal defense lawyer's opinion, that means all of them and their employees should be worried about police enforcement. Now, if you or a friend or loved one find yourself on the wrong side of a cannabis enforcement action, contact my firm today for a full consultation. Also, if you like this video, please give us a thumbs up and consider subscribing to our channel, as we're going to continue to produce videos on useful legal topics like issues in DC's formerly Wild West like cannabis laws, and in a future video we'll also discuss what to expect if arrested and prosecuted for a distribution of cannabis offense.